Well, unless you've been hiding under a rock, you probably have heard all about Michael Cassidy, the man who tore down the Satanist statue in the Iowa state capitol. Due to Cassidy's bold actions, he is now facing serious legal issues. Tonight, we have the blessing to talk with Cassidy's lawyer, Davis Younts, because in God's providence, I just so happened to book him for this week's episode long before the Iowa incident occurred. We'll also talk all about our original topic of discussion, the state of the American military. We'll discuss the amazing work that Davis is doing to bring about a spiritual revival among an institution that is in the midst of a full blown pagan takeover. So please stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations about culture, theology, and politics to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. My name is Connor. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ, and I am host of this podcast, and we appreciate you joining us. And like I said at the top of the episode, I'm joined by Davis Younts. So, Davis, go ahead and say hello to the audience and tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hey, thanks, Connor. Great to join you here. Yeah, I'm a Christian, a husband, a father of two amazing girls, a homeschool dad. I'm a military veteran. I retired from the United States Air Force Reserves as a lieutenant colonel. I served 11 years on active duty as a JAG in the Air Force, and I have had the opportunity and the privilege of practicing law. I started my own firm in 2019. We focus on primarily on representing military members, but we also engage in a lot of religious freedom issues and try to engage culture for Christ by representing Christians in the legal field. So it's a real blessing to be able to do what I do.
Awesome. Well, so glad to have you back, Davis. And before we get started, for those of you joining us, be sure to check out last week's episode. We had an awesome conversation all about storytelling, where Michael and I actually gave some pushback to our guest, Faith Moore. She was great. We enjoyed having her. It was a good discussion, but we had some fun back and forth on that. So be sure to check that out. And of course, like and share this video to boost us in the algorithms. Follow us on Twitter at Forge and A for additional content and updates on the show. Share this video on Twitter or X or Twix, whatever you want to call it. And be sure to join us over on YouTube and Rumble if you want to actually be a part of the chat and join in on the discussion. We really appreciate it. It does help us out. So, Davis, I want to go ahead and just dive straight in here. So, obviously, our original topic, we're going to talk all about the military, and we definitely will do that tonight. But everyone's talking about the incident in Iowa. So maybe go ahead and just give our audience, for those who have been living under a rock this week, give them a little bit of a rundown of kind of what initially occurred.
Yeah, so for those who don't know a lot of background, the Iowa State Capitol building played host to a display that was erected in honor of Satan, a statue, a display of the idol Baphomet in honor of Satan was put up there by an organization called the Satanic Temple of Iowa. It was, I guess, a limited time display, about 2 weeks. And it stood there uninterrupted, if you will, until last week when a gentleman walked into the Capitol, the state capitol there in Iowa, saw it, and as he saw it and looked at it, he felt compelled, based on his Christian faith, to do something about it. So he removed the head, disassembled the statue, threw away the head in a trash bag, and once he was done, carefully put the candles back, stacked everything back where it was, and turned himself into law enforcement there at the Capitol.
Mm. And everything proceeds from there. And obviously, it's been a firestorm in terms of the attention that's been on it. So, what was the initial reaction from? So, it was the official Satanic Temple that put up the display. So, how did they react to hearing the news, and what's their initial response to Cassidy?
So we have a limited amount of information that we can talk about so far, but what we know so far, at least our understanding, is that the local law enforcement asked if they wanted to press charges, and they said that they did. And so now Michael Cassidy is facing what they call fourth degree mischief, criminal mischief in the state of Iowa, which is related to the destruction of private property. And so he is facing a misdemeanor charge in Iowa.
Okay, gotcha. So Obviously, I know you're limited on everything that you can say because it's just the nature of these things. But um, for as much as you can say, I mean, what kind of angle do you think that they're gonna initially take? I mean, obviously, First Amendment's been the debate on Twitter surrounding this issue. But do you think that's the angle they're gonna take? And if so, what's kind of your tactic for what you would say in response? I guess.
Yeah, I don't really start off analyzing this really as a First Amendment issue. I really look at this as a distinction between good and evil, right? So there's a lot of things we could talk about just generally in society, what we have accepted as good or permissible. So, one example that comes to my mind is just like imagine that the Ku Klux Klan was permitted to put up a display in the Iowa state capitol, honoring the heroes of the Ku Klux Klan. Would anyone want to stand idly by and allow that to be there, to allow that to be in a place of honor and respect in a state capitol building, an official government building, and allow that to persist? And I would hope everyone would join together and say, no, we're not going to allow something like that, a monument to the Ku Klux Klan, to persist there. And I would say the same analysis can apply here. This is a situation where this is evil. This is evil embodied. If we cannot call the worship of Satan, the erecting of an idol to honor Satan, evil, then I think we have serious fundamental problems in our society. So even setting aside, deeper First Amendment issues and things like that, we just have a critical question of good versus evil. This is purely embodiment of evil, and I think to me, that's where the discussion has to start. And, again, this is early on in the legal process. There's a lot of things that are going to happen that we have to work on. But ultimately, part of me just looks at this as this week is the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, right? And the Boston Tea Party involved the careful, targeted, thoughtful destruction of private property for a political end when other political efforts were exhausted. And I do think there are some similarities here. You have a situation where the elected officials didn't act. They refused to act. They wouldn't act to stop what was evil. And so, in a spur of the moment, in a decision, Mr. Cassidy engaged in disassembling this and then did it peacefully, cleaned up the garbage after himself, didn't disrupt anything. The legislature was not in session, and then turned himself in, submitted himself to law enforcement, and is prepared to face the consequences. So I can't speak to legal strategy so far, but I think those are some of the things that have been going through my mind as I've been praying through this, talking to the legal team and working through this. There's a lot of similarities, I think, to the Boston Tea Party. That's probably a good place to start if we look for a historical analogy.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely agree with you. And I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to this particular situation is the fact that when you actually look at the different posts and websites of the Satanic Temple, and I don't know if there's if the Iowa chapter, whatever the official organization is called, I don't know what their individual posts are, but I know when it comes to the sort of global network of Satanic temples, or at least the national, I should say, they really they talk as if they are atheists and they aren't actually religious, and they're just doing it to sort of make a point and to be heard by, specifically, they mention Christians and just people of faith in general. So I also feel like there's an argument that they're probably going to take it from a freedom of speech angle, but at the same time, I don't know if there's a legal term for it, but it really seems more like trying to instigate a response from a group that is trying to ultimately sort of harass another people group. So I mean that's kind of what has been going through my mind lately. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. We could start talking in terms of is the Satanic Temple a religion? Is it a valid religion? Is it something our courts would even recognize as a religion, and therefore should it be protected? So I do think there's some of those conversations that could be had about this, but ultimately, I just what bothers me on such a deep, just simplistic level is This is a question of good versus evil. Would our founding fathers have been okay with an idol to Satan being erected in any state capitol building? And I think we have to recognize that's part of what we're dealing with here. This is just simply a question of good and evil. This is evil. This is the embodiment of evil. This is the epitome of evil. So this isn't, to me, I don't see this as a question of how far we have to restrict the First Amendment. I think we have to recognize that there's still morality, and all legislation, everything has a moral premise to it. And so we have to be able to say some things are evil, some things are just simply bad, and be able to recognize that. If we can't do that, we're never going to have a free functioning civil society, and certainly not one like we've enjoyed in this country.
Yeah, exactly. And Will from Renaissance of Men, he's actually in the chat. He said, they're not lying. They are atheists. They don't believe in God. They worship the self. That is true Satanist doctrine. Yeah, exactly. And you talked about the moral premise for laws and how all laws essentially have a moral premise. So obviously, something that we've heard so many times in recent years is the idea that you can't legislate morality. Can you speak to that? Because my views have evolved. In fact, if you look at some of the earliest episodes of the podcast, my views have evolved, and I think they've at least solidified. But go ahead and speak to that for a moment, and we'll just go from there.
Yeah, no, as an attorney, as a former military officer, it's something I have worked through a lot in my own life, in my own Christian faith. And, I would say, maybe 10 years ago or so, I sort of tended libertarian more completely, I would say, in my thought process and even my philosophy, because it does seem very easy to say. It seems very tempting to say, well, we can't legislate morality, so we should just go into sort of a neutral approach to the public square. And the problem is we fall into areas that just don't make sense very, very quickly, and we end up ignoring the reality that's either Christ or chaos. So what I will say is, there is a moral basis for every law. Every law in society throughout history does have a moral basis. The question is, what is the basis of that morality? What is the standard that we are talking about? Now, I wouldn't consider myself a Christian nationalist. I haven't even really personally struggled to understand what I think I would mean by that term. But what I will say is this: I think that our nation is the best example we've seen in world history where there has been religious freedom. And why is that? Christianity is not a faith. The Bible does not teach forced conversion, right? And so I think that's something people start to think, legislation of morality means you're trying to force people on, your faith on other people. By virtue of the nature of Orthodox Christian theology, it's not a religion of force. It's a religion of faith and of peaceful conversion and of changing hearts and minds with truth and love and God's grace and God working in that. So I think that's a really important distinction, because if people don't understand that, they can get caught up in this idea that somehow force is involved. And I would flip it, and I would say that force, when you look at forcing morality on other people, it actually comes in the modern sense. That kind of force, that kind of morality that would be afraid of being forced on people, comes from a Darwinian ethic, right? It comes from a Darwinian ethic. It comes from the concepts of communism and socialism, where they seek to control every facet of conscience and to force beliefs onto people. That's not where the Christian faith comes from. So as we look at these things, I do believe that the word of God, that God is our standard. That is the moral standard for everything. That's what we should look to. But frankly, that's what our founding fathers looked to. I've read historical accounts that say, aside from Montesquieu, the most quoted book that was discussed in forming our Constitution wasn't just the Bible, but it was the book of Deuteronomy from the Bible.
And Leviticus.
So that's historically accurate. Then we have to understand there is a pattern. There is an established law that is out there that is good, and we should be seeking to understand that and how to apply God's moral law to today. And if we do that, then we see the blessings that come from God. So as Christians, we shouldn't run from that, right? We should understand that the following Christ is a path to incredible peace and blessing, not just now, but for eternity. So again, I think it's important. I think we can have these discussions. And really, I think, my hope with the reason I agreed to get involved and represent, Michael Cassidy, he's a veteran. That's how I knew him. That's how he knew to reach out to me, mutual friends, and he's a veteran. But, I think we can have these discussions about morality and ethics in our law, about just laws and unjust laws. And a lot of it comes down to, again, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here too much, but when we say you can't legislate morality, what we're doing is we're buying into a secular myth that says our Christian faith doesn't have anything to offer in the public square, and we end up buying into the myth of neutrality. And that's not loving and kind, because we're allowing the world to fall into chaos. And I think so much of what we see in our nation today, what we see in our country today, from drag queen story hour to other things, is because we've lost that moral compass. We've lost our foundation and footing.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, the law is a teacher. That's what Scripture tells us. Obviously, when it comes to God's law, obviously, the whole premise is that mankind could not live up to the standard that God laid out in God's law. But Paul specifically talks about how the law was a teacher until something better could come along, referring to, of course, the new covenant. And ultimately, that whole line of thinking, the law being a teacher, we can see that in today. Now, obviously, we're not trying to bring about heaven on earth. That can't be done. I mean, that's just the reality of it. But we can try to bring about as moral of a living situation as possible among our fellow men by having moral legislation passed and moral laws upheld. And ultimately, we've seen signs of this. We have seen, for better or worse, we have seen it work in the Prohibition era. We've seen it work when it comes to, right now, for example, I'm going to use a really modern one. And we did an episode all about the legislation around limiting the use of porn and having age consent laws. And we've already seen the porn companies cry out that they're going to cry out that if you make their customers verify that they are over 18 years old, that they are going to lose a large percentage of their consumer base. And so what does that tell you immediately? So
Right.
I mean, they're all but admitting that they market themselves to minors. I mean, you could, I'm sure they're trying to make the argument that people just don't want to, verify in general. But I mean, tough cookies. We know that that's only a portion of that customer base that you will lose. And we actually see these a lot of these. They're trying to weasel their way around that legislation as much as possible in these states that are passing these age verification laws. But ultimately, we see that the porn industry has lost a ton of money from these laws being passed, and that's a good thing. If we can get our country to be less addicted to pornography as a result of moral laws, that is an absolute win. So I definitely think that the law can be a teacher in that. So I don't know if you had any additional thoughts to add on that.
Yeah, I just think that the biggest thing that I keep going back to and that I think about constantly is just, everything you just said there, and just this idea that blessing comes from God, from God's law, from following that, from seeking that. And we have developed a sort of Christianity, a pietism, where we're almost afraid to call sin, and then ignore the consequences of it. And that's not loving, that's not kind, that's good. And I mean, it should just be shocking. I mean, how can we even just sit here and not become, angry, a righteous indignation at the concept that the porn industry suffers when we put age verification laws in place?
Right.
I mean, what does that tell you? I mean, how dare they, right? How dare people make a living in any good and decent society by turning, people into sex objects, into objectifying women, into feeding into the need for human trafficking and putting into that. And that always leads to child trafficking. It always leads to those lines being blurred. That's horrific, and we should be upset about that. We should be fired up about that. We should be able to say, yes, that is wrong. That is evil. And that's my whole point about this display in the Iowa legislature. And we could talk, oh, it's not that big of a deal. We can just let it go. We can just pass it by. But again, just imagine the message that sends to school children. School children are walking through the Iowa State Capitol building, being exposed to Satan worship. Is that good? Is
Yeah.
that beneficial? Is that a positive thing to say? And again, what we allow sometimes is what we hold up as acceptable, right? And that's the point you say, with prohibition or other things, and we could have long debates about should drugs be legalized or what drugs should be legalized and what does that look like. But the reality is we send some of it is our children. It is about protecting children and protecting those that are weak. And if we say something is legal or allowed, it does tend to encourage its use.
Yep.
Look at the state of Oregon. I don't know if you've looked at this at all, but one of the things I've seen is, Oregon essentially legalized all hard drugs.
Yep.
It's essentially blanket drug legalization. I was born in Oregon. I still have family and relatives in Oregon. And what we've seen since they passed that law is that experiment, if you will, is an absolute disaster. So here's what they do in Oregon. If you are picked up in possession of a small amount of an illegal drug, so an amount that would be appropriate with personal use, what they do is they issue you a citation and they say you have a choice. You have a certain number of days, I think it's 60 days, to go and do a voluntary intake, free screening for drug addiction and get support for drug addiction. It's absolutely free. If you don't do that within a set period of time, then you'll pay $100 fine. The percentage of people that have taken advantage of that is minute. It's less than 1% of people
Right.
that have actually gone to and done an intake screening that have been issued a citation for that in Oregon since that law's been there. So that's just an example, I think, of how we have to be very thoughtful and careful as a society if we're going to continue to exist as a society that doesn't fall apart when we look at those things. So great points.
Yeah. Yeah. So going back to Cassidy's case, then, so there's been a lot of people on X arguing all about, like people like Jenna Ellis, for example, arguing all about how this wasn't the way that he should have done it. If he had a real issue with it, he should have fought the statue being put up, the legality of that in court. So he should have gone through the the proper means of addressing the situation. So I mean, first of all, my initial thought, I assume that they're that to do that would be essentially pointless because I believe that the statue is only going to be on display for like 14 days or something like that. There was a time limit to it, so I'm assuming that point is kind of moot because of how long it would have taken to address it. But I mean, what's your response to people that have that criticism?
Well, I think there's a couple of things to think about. I think that those that are sitting on the sidelines and not acting can always criticize those people that take action. Number
Yeah.
one. Number two, I will tell you, Michael's a fighter pilot. That's his background, right? That's his background. This wasn't premeditated. This wasn't planned out. This wasn't a long drawn out thought process for him. This was a moment of righteous indignation. And he acted, and even in that act, he then realized, I need to clean this up. I need to make this clean. I need to pick up the garbage, and I'm going to submit myself to the appropriate law enforcement. So I think that's important. Now, after the fact, if we're going to Monday morning quarterback this thing, we could talk about a lot of things. But here's the issue. In the state of Iowa, there's an application process. I believe that there were elected leaders, officials, appointed officials, magistrates, if you will, civil magistrates in Iowa that were afraid to say no to this.
Right.
So, I would say they failed to act when they could have to put a stop to this evil. They could have said, no, we're not going to approve an idol being put up to honor an embodiment of evil. That's not appropriate. We're going to say no. And then, yes, potentially this satanic organization could have sued the state of Iowa. They could have sued the state legislature, and they could have been involved in long drawn out legislation about whether or not they can put this up there. right? And so sure, we can talk about that, but what we do know is that elected leaders, the officials there, didn't act. They didn't put a stop to this. They didn't act to take it down, disassemble it, and face the consequences. So a citizen acted, saw this injustice, and acted accordingly. And again, there are gonna be consequences that we're gonna work through with him. I believe there's justification here potentially. Again, I don't want to go into all the details just yet. I do think there's questions about whether or not this was a just act, and whether or not his actions were justified, particularly in the unique, peaceful, nonviolent way that he handled himself and subjected himself to law enforcement. But that is, that's for a later time. But I don't think there was a lot that could have been done differently if we're going to step back. And really, the question is, why didn't someone act? Why didn't an elected leader in Iowa act? And I've used this example already, but I just go back to this point. Are we going to recognize moral limits on what we're going to allow to be displayed in public in a government building? I mean, would it be okay to erect a statue of Molech and picture, dismembered infants before a statue of Molech? Would we allow that in the government building? I mean, that's the same type of thing that we're dealing with here. That's what this stands for. This stands for death and destruction and murder. And so I do think we can recognize that. Again, we can talk about legislative morality and other things, but we can recognize we would all object to a monument to the KKK being erected in the Iowa State Capitol building, and people should be there. There should have been a reaction to this. I think part of what is just resonating with so many people is, why didn't someone act? This was up for almost 2 weeks.
Right.
No one acted. Why didn't someone act? Why wasn't this a bigger deal? I think that's convicting. That should be convicting to all Christians throughout this nation is why weren't we more concerned? It bothered us. People were talking about how much it bothered them, but why wasn't something done?
No. Yeah, and unfortunately, I have actually something that's been I don't know if it's funny, frustrating, a little bit of both, but I've seen so many posts of individuals where there were screenshots of basically before the incident with Cassidy occurred, and there were so many individuals that were like, "Man, someone just needs to go in there and tear it down," and someone beneath them would be like, "Oh yeah, Mr. Big Tough Guy, like anyone's like you're actually gonna go and do that," and then it's like someone did it, and then of course all those same people that were saying, "Oh yeah, Mr. Tough Guy," all of them are the ones that are out there, like, "Oh, this shouldn't have been done," and it's like, guys, you practically were like prodding for a response by telling people like, "Oh yeah, you're all talk," and that's just annoying. That's just something that's bothered me personally. But
Right.
so a couple things that I wanted to touch on as well. So the Face Act and all the stories surrounding the Face Act. And for those who don't know, I don't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's essentially the legislation that was passed that prevents individuals from preventing someone access to a medical facility, and of course that's being used specifically the uh, for Planned Parenthood and individuals that are pro-abortion uh, to now justify um, legally pursuing their ideological opponents who are outside of Planned Parenthood, praying over individuals and trying to convince mothers not to go and abort their babies. And in recent times, the FACE Act has now been used by the DOJ to really overreach and really persecute individuals who were accused of violating it, even ones who had been acquitted. I'm spacing on his name now, but we've covered him previously on the show. But there was a man in Pennsylvania who was raided by the federal government at gunpoint at his house because he had been accused of the FACE Act by an incident that a lower court had already acquitted him of and basically said no harm, no foul, and threw out the case. Well, the DOJ picked it up, I believe, almost like 2 years later. It's been a little foggy, so feel free to check back in the old episode. But I'm saying all this to say, do you think that do you suspect that there could be an incident where a higher court is going to intervene, or the DOJ is going to try to use this as an opportunity to persecute Cassidy, to basically make an example out of him?
I don't think so. I think that there are I don't think there's a legal basis or legal theory that it would allow for that, because again, this wasn't something like pre-planned or premeditated. So I really don't think there's something there. It could happen, unfortunately, particularly with this DOJ that we have in place. Elections have consequences.
Right.
So, I think that's part of the reason why so many people have gotten behind him and worked hard to create a legal defense fund for him. So in that eventuality, there are resources there to help him if it did go there. I don't think that's where this is headed. But you're absolutely right. You're talking about Mark Houck, the gentleman in
Yes.
Pennsylvania
Yeah.
who was, they tried to prosecute him under the FACE Act. He was acquitted of that, and that was after the state of Pennsylvania had looked at it and not brought any charges or dismissed any charges against him. But it is a constant concern. But again, the FACE Act. One of the concerns I have with the FACE Act is talk about legislating morality. That is a federal law specifically designed to target people who are engaged in a peaceful effort, typically in a peaceful effort to save the lives of unborn children. Right. So that's the activity that Mark Houck was engaged in. He was doing this. And the FACE Act is a reflection of a legislation of morality by people that want to and desire the murder of unborn children. So I think those are some of the realities we have to wake up to, because again, this idea of a neutral public square is a myth, and it's a dangerous myth. It's a lie. I think it's a satanic deception, quite frankly. But it does cause so many churches and so many good Christians to just simply, pietistically wash their hands of what's going on in the world. And it has dangerous and negative consequences for society when that happens.
Yeah, exactly. Now, you did mention that you don't think there's a legal justification for that type of overreach to occur, and I would say that that's the same case with those FACE Act incidences. But obviously, you're the legal expert. I'm not. But but all that to say, I think that they maybe would do that overreach. Now, the good thing is, I hope that outright Satanism is still unpopular enough to where I don't think that the Biden administration wants to put their name behind that. If they're going to jump into anything, with the warped idea of women's rights, at least the groundwork has been laid for them to sort of come in with the FACE Act and sort of have some cover that they're just really adamant about protecting a woman's right, whereas protecting the right of Satanists to erect an idol maybe is not the most popular thing to do so close to an election. But we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. Michaela in the chat said, "We can't acknowledge two gods. America says, in God we trust. We can't possibly say that as Americans, we should acknowledge Satanism as a religion in the courts." And similarly, playing off of that, the Renaissance man said, "If it's freedom of Satanist expression to put it up, is it not freedom of Christian expression to tear it down?" There we go. Once Upon a Reset also said, engagement with the false left-right American political paradigm is just as morally corrupt as engaging with outright Satanism. You could even argue that it is worse because of its hidden evils. The average American citizen, including most Christians, are drunk/intoxicated on the false left-right American political paradigm, and most will remain this way from the womb to the tomb. I do agree with that to a point. I think that it's correct that we shouldn't focus on just left and right. I think that especially the individuals that we refer to as the Uniparty, they really want us to focus on left and right. But more to Davis's point, it's really good versus evil. Now, sometimes the reason why I say I don't fully agree with that is just because sometimes we are faced with a decision where we have to make a choice between a crap sandwich or a crap sandwich that wants to kill you. Yeah. Bad analogy there, but my point is the Republican Party has plenty of flaws, lots of corruption. But at the end of the day, we do sometimes have to pick a political vehicle to try to bring about some moral wins. Not that it's ever going to be perfect, but anyways, that's just my response to that. And feel free to add anything additional to that if you want, Davis.
Yeah, I would just say to that, I think that is one of the challenges we face. We live in a fallen world, so we have all of these imperfect politicians. We have people that are involved in politics for imperfect reasons, imperfect motivations. they become corrupted by the system, whether it's power, money, whatever it is. And so it can be easy to sort of fall into that dynamic. But I also think we can say, okay, if one party, for example, has a pro-life platform when it comes to abortion, and another party has a clear pro-death platform, then we can look at that and say, okay, we can evaluate. I would struggle to vote for someone, I guess I would say, that can sign off on a platform that is pro-death, that is in
Right.
favor of murdering unborn children. So, I do think sometimes we complicate things, and we can simply say it's not that we vote on one issue, but we can say, there are certain things where good versus evil is pretty clear, and I think we can vote and act accordingly. Sometimes it's not a choice. Sometimes it's a shade of gray, even on that issue. But again, I do struggle to understand how some people can say, well, if one party has a pro-life platform and they say that's what they stand for, and another party has a pro-death platform, that's where I struggle. I think maybe similar to some of the concerns you have, but it's never easy, I guess, in a
Right.
fallen world.
Right. And at the end of the day, when you're voting for someone that says that they're pro-life, that's what you're putting your vote behind. If they choose to betray that when they get to Washington or whatever office they hold, that's not, that's them betraying their voters. That's them betraying the platform that they stand for. So it's more upon the voters to hold those people accountable than it is to be like, oh well, let's just the Republican Party is no good. It's like, no, let's reform it because let's actually hold them to the ideals that they say they espouse. But we could go on all night about that. But I wanted to just briefly mention the statues that were removed over the last several years of different monumental figures of our country, whether that be Jefferson, Grant, Washington. Many of these statues were vandalized and outright taken down, some through the legal means that Jenna Ellis was talking about, and others through just a mob coming and tearing down the statue. So when it comes to those statues, obviously there's been a lot of conversation from the sort of more freedom-minded side of the aisle, saying that we absolutely shouldn't be tearing down these statues. They're a monument to our history. Obviously, the argument is now being used on X for, oh, I thought you guys didn't like when statues were taken down in regards to the Michael Cassidy incident. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe speak to that a bit, Davis. I know we've touched on aspects of that argument, but let's go ahead and maybe flesh that out further.
Yeah, honestly, I really don't think it's a good comparison to what happened in this situation. And I brought up the Boston Tea Party earlier, and I would just kind of say that again. The Boston Tea Party involved a limited, targeted, specific dumping of tea, which was private property, and about $2 million worth in today's money of private property into the harbor for political reasons after political means had been exhausted. Right. And so I think that's a better comparison here, because it was in a government building. It was being permitted to be displayed by the government, but it was private property, and it was taken down and disassembled in a non-disruptive, peaceful, non-violent way. And then the individual that did it was willing to turn himself into law enforcement and face the consequences for it. So I think that's very, very different than, riots or wanton destruction of a statue or a memorial. And then the other difference is many of these statues and memorials are paid for with tax dollars. These are erected by the government. They're erected by tax dollars or in cooperation with that. And so it's not private property. So I do think there is a distinction there. And I don't think it's necessarily the same thing. I think you can also say it is a question of good versus evil. I think I can, with a clean conscience and without any hypocrisy at all, say I don't think it's appropriate to take down or defile a statue or deface a statue of Thomas Jefferson because he was a historical figure, but a flawed and sinful man. But I think I can say it's not okay to do that, but it is okay to recognize worshiping Satan is evil and bad and not good and destructive and has no place in our society, and that should be taken down. And I think that we need to be able to have those conversations in a free society. We need to be able to have that conversation about that, but we also need to just simplify it and say some things are evil and they should not have a place in a government building, in a free nation, in our free society.
Amen. I agree. It's a sad day, though, that we have to pretend that the removal of Thomas Jefferson is on equal moral footing as the removal of a statue to literally Satan. I mean,
Right,
I
but
mean, goodness,
that's where the argument is, and I mean it almost seems like comedy, right?
it
But
is.
again, it's like it is Christ or chaos. I mean, we are in the upside down when we are trying to justify evil, and there are a lot more examples. I mean, there are people that want to justify drag queen story hour
Yep.
or provocative shows for children by drag queens in public, that seems like grooming for pedophilia, that, well, that's protected by the First Amendment. We can't say no to that. No, I think we can, especially when we're talking about it involving children, because that's evil. That's not okay. And we can't stand by for that, because that gets very, very dangerous very quickly.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I want to pivot to the topic that we were initially going to discuss, which is the state of the military, because you obviously have a lot of experience with that, given your background. So let's go ahead and start there. Um, Maybe if you can just go ahead and give us sort of a summary of how you currently see the state of our American military.
Yeah, I look at the state of the military today, and I just shake my head, and I wonder sadly how we got here. Again, I love the military. I love the men and women that served. Like I said before, I retired as a lieutenant colonel from the United States Air Force Reserves after serving 11 years on active duty. I've represented countless military members. I deployed, supported Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. So I do bring a perspective on that. But where we're at today in our military, just the reality of the picture in our military today is we are in the midst of a recruiting and retention crisis. That means we cannot keep good people in the military. People are leaving the military early. They're not re-enlisting. They're not signing up for more time, and somewhat unprecedented levels. So we're looking at a real retention crisis, which is extremely expensive, costly, and can be dangerous in the long run to our national security. But the other thing we're seeing at the same time is a recruiting crisis, meaning that people are not joining the military at the same rate and the same percentage as they normally do. And so that is a serious problem. But one of the issues we see, and as we start to dive in, we can talk about kind of specific, what is the diagnosis? Those are the symptoms. Obviously, there's something significantly wrong in our military, but I think there's a lot of different things we can look at, to diagnose this and the cause. But that is the reality. It is not hyperbole to say there's a retention crisis and there is a recruiting crisis in our military.
Hmm. So, given the, I mean, do you think that the military is actually prepared if there was conflict?
A difficult question. I have serious concerns about aspects of our military readiness when we look just across the board, when we look at the state of our equipment and other things. And here's the problem. The Department of Defense, our military has a larger budget, almost double than any other nation in the world, right? So look at China, look at any other nation in the world. Our military budget in this country is almost double that of any other nation. And the Department of Defense, the Pentagon, cannot pass a financial audit. They haven't passed a financial audit since you have to go back to the 80s, and there weren't even significant audits done then. So they've essentially failed these 6 key audits that have been done in a row. So what does that mean? Why is that concerning? That means that you have an organization that's given unprecedented amounts of money and resources that cannot account for personnel, supplies, can't even account for where money is being spent, but they keep being given a blank check. So if it was a business, if it was a large charity, if it was a church where they cannot pass a financial audit, they can't pass a personnel audit, they can't pass an inventory audit, again and again and again, we would say there's something wrong with this organization. There's something fundamentally wrong with it. And if people aren't being held accountable for it, that's a problem. So, the common solution that we see politically and in Washington is we dump more. If there's a problem in the military, what do? We dump more money into it. We dump more money into it. And that's a very popular thing for the uniparty to say, well, we can't touch military funding. We can't touch how we support our troops. Don't you want to support the troops? But if we can't even pass an audit to understand where the resources are going and no one's held accountable for wasting resources, that's one of the big problems with the military.
Yeah. And to your point, you talked about, how we can't even, not only can we not audit them, but we can't even prevent the military from sort of abusing a lot of the funding that we've given them. And specifically, you mentioned that it's really hard for legislators to, especially Republican ones, to say that they are okay with defunding some of this. Some of the military aid. We just recently passed the NDAA, and those who don't know, it's the National Defense Authorization Act. And in fact, let me go ahead and pull up this chart here. So this is a post from Chip Roy. So this is actually comparing the NDAA, the House bill, and Chuck Schumer in the Senate, his bill, and then it shows the compromise bill. So this is what the GOP-led House originally was trying to get done with the NDAA. So they were trying to end Biden's tax-funded abortion travel fund and the taxpayer-funded gender transition surgeries. That's happening in the military as well. And Biden's radical climate agenda protects service members who were discharged for refusing the COVID-19 vaccine, something you're very familiar with. Ban drag shows and drag queen story hour on DoD installations. Prohibits critical race theory within the military. Creates an inspector general for Ukraine aid accountability. Prohibits race-based admissions at military academies. Eliminates chief diversity officers. And then expends the abusive FISA spying powers. That's a really big one that so many individuals were incredibly bothered with as well. And Schumer's bill, of course, had none of that. So then the compromise bill. So this is what was actually passed in the Senate. And for those of you in the state of Tennessee, like myself, both of our senators voted to pass this compromise bill, which is a load of crap. So here's the compromise bill. It did not end the taxpayer-funded abortion. It did not end the gender transition surgeries that are funded by taxpayer expense. It did not end the climate agenda that's being siphoned straight from our taxpayer dollars straight into the military. It did not protect it sort of protect the members who are discharged from the COVID-19 vaccine. And we can talk about that in a moment because I know that's your area of expertise, Davis. Right. And then it did not ban the drag queen story hours or the drag shows, I should say, on the DoD installations. It did prohibit critical race theory. Now, the reason why that's not much of a win is they just keep renaming critical race theory and they just keep disguising it as different things. So that's kind of an easy workaround, honestly, for the DoD to comply with. They just have to not label it critical race theory, and I'm sure there's a pretty easy workaround in that front. Then creates an inspector general for Ukraine aid accountability. The compromise on that was weak, is what this graphic is showing us here. I don't know all the specifics on that, but then it did not prohibit race-based admissions, and it did not eliminate the chief diversity officer, and it did extend the abusive FISA spying powers. So basically, the only sort of win that we got there was really the COVID-19 vaccine. So, I mean, do you have much of an update for us on the effectiveness of this supposed win that we received from funding the NDAA?
As it applies to the COVID-19 vaccine, it's not even close to a win. And in fact, for me, for most of my clients, the language that was in there, we were advocating against because it's offensive at the end of the day. So I can get into the background a little bit on that. So what a lot of people that don't understand about the COVID fight in the military and understand it, they think it was, primarily about a vaccine, and military members get a ton of vaccines. I had a ton of vaccines when I served in the military. That's normal course of business for the military to give a lot of vaccines. So people think, well, what was the big deal about this vaccine? There were two huge issues behind this COVID vaccine mandate that were the problem, and they really did create what I would call a constitutional crisis. And I don't think that's hyperbole. So
Yeah.
two issues. The first was related to religious accommodation requests. In the United States military, when you join the military, you swear an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Constitutional rights still apply to military members. There can be limits on them based on the nature of military service, or limits on your First Amendment free speech rights in a uniform, things like that. But ultimately, constitutional rights still apply. Religious accommodations are part of our military, and over the last few decades, we've gotten better in recognizing religious accommodations in the military. And there's federal law, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And what it basically says is the default answer to a religious accommodation is yes. If you serve in the United States military and you have a religious objection to something, the military is supposed to do an individualized look at it and say, can we reasonably accommodate this without compromising the mission? So, for example, you could be in the military and you could be vegan or a vegetarian. And guess what? You can go to the chow hall and there's going to be options for you to do that. Now, in a deployed environment, is it going to be perfect? Maybe. If there's austere environments, no. But is the military going to do what they can to accommodate that? Certainly, absolutely. There's a long history of that. There's uniform exceptions for religion that occur, and even to the point of what I would say absurdity in some respects. Things like beard accommodations for someone who claims to be Norse pagan in the military. So in limited circumstances, perhaps you should get that. But what happened during COVID is the military engaged in an intentional plan to ignore the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, to ignore religious accommodations, and they just engaged in a plan to blanket deny religious accommodation requests, not do an individualized review, even at a point when the CDC and all experts around the world were saying, natural immunity is just as good or better than the vaccines. There was, right at the time the mandate came out for the military, the week before, the CDC put out guidance for schools that basically said, hey, treat those with natural immunity and those that have had the vaccine the same. There's not even really a point in doing anything different with those folks. That's what the CDC put out as guidance the week before the military mandate went in place. And again, the military not only did they just blanket deny religious accommodation requests, they were bold about it. They encouraged chaplains to trap military members into talking about politics instead of their faith in these interviews. And in litigation, in federal litigation, in a federal appeals court, an attorney working for the Department of Defense in that litigation, employed by the Department of Justice, literally told the judge that they didn't believe they had to comply with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. They believed they could ignore it, and that it was only an issue that they had to comply with if they were sued. And a judge told them they had to comply with a federal law, right? Which brings us to the other piece of the objection that people had to the COVID mandate. There is a federal law in place that prohibits the United States military from experimenting on or forcing military members to take an emergency use or an experimental use authorization medication, because unfortunately we have a sad history of the military experimenting on military personnel and not giving them informed consent in doing it. So there is a very narrow exception where the President of the United States can issue an exception in certain circumstances, but otherwise it is against federal law for the military to mandate someone take an emergency use authorization vaccine. What happened during COVID is the FDA approved a formula of a vaccine that, according to the FDA documents, was legally distinct from the emergency use authorization vaccine that the pharmaceutical companies had produced in mass, right? So I say all of that to say there was a legitimate legal question as to whether or not an FDA-approved vaccine was available for military members, and that was one of the issues. So it was a question of whether or not it was a lawful order to receive a vaccine when there was no FDA-approved vaccine made available. And literally, military members were going and they were asking, can I see the vial of the vaccine that you're going to give me? And it would say emergency use authorization on it. Not FDA approved, emergency use authorization. So again, I say that to say that created a constitutional crisis because to many, and I was arguing that the executive branch was ignoring federal law in mandating this, and it was not a lawful order. This NDAA does nothing to address the violations of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act or these religious accommodations, and it calls the order, the language in the NDAA called the order a lawful order. So it said those who were discharged because they violated a lawful order to get the vaccine can come back in, and they can apply to have their records fixed by the Board of Corrections or what's called the Discharge Review Board. This NDAA does nothing for these military members. It does nothing they couldn't already do on their own before this NDAA. And that language about a lawful order is a slap in the face, because that was one of the legal issues that wasn't litigated in the federal courts, because every time it came close, the federal courts would say it was moot or you couldn't get in the courtroom door. So we had to individually fight that. So I fought that at administrative separation boards. And, the first board that it was presented to in the Navy officers that were presented that evidence agreed with my client and myself that it was not a lawful order, that the government couldn't prove it was a lawful order to do that. But that wasn't addressed in federal court. The lawyers that were bringing that civil litigation never got in the courthouse door to address that specific issue. So unfortunately, this NDAA did nothing to protect these military members. And it really was somewhat offensive that it had that lawful order language in there. So now we go back to the retention and the recruiting crisis. What people don't realize, it was a story a couple of weeks ago, but the Army and the Air Force are sending out letters to military members they kicked out. They discharged them over the COVID mandate, whether it was a religious accommodation or whether they were challenging lawfulness of the order. They kicked them out. They got a DD 214. That's your separation certificate from the United States military. That's the document you have as a veteran that documents your military service. And it says commission of a serious offense or serious misconduct. And they received a less than honorable discharge, right? Most of them received a general discharge, which means loss of the GI Bill, loss of veterans preference points for jobs. And you have this DD 214, employers ask to see that, and it says you committed a serious offense. So there are thousands of military members in that boat, and the Air Force and the Army send out form letters that said, hey, come back in and serve if you want to. We're not going to fix your DD 214. We're not going to do any of those things to make it right, but you can apply to the Board of Corrections or the Discharge Review Board, which you could already do. But that's a 2 to 3 year process with a very low percentage success rate.
Good grief.
I know that's a lot. Sorry, I feel like
you're fine. You took us on a journey, and we needed to hear it. And it's just wild that, I mean, unfortunately, it's really sad that my two senators in the state of Tennessee voted for that, because ultimately they have decent voting records overall compared to most senators. The Senate is just a whole circus in general. But my goodness, that's still, I think ultimately it's just boils down to they don't want to say that they cut funding towards the military, because it sounds good if you just leave it at that. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you realize no, they weren't willing to fight by holding some of the funding hostage in order to get actual conservative wins in the military. They basically did nothing to stop the military from actually being taken over, and it sounds like they basically did nothing for the individuals who were discharged due to the COVID vaccine, as we just learned. And so that's absolutely disappointing. And I think anyone in Tennessee should definitely make sure to let Marsha Blackburn and Haggerty know, because they need to hear from us, and do so respectfully, of course. But I mean, unfortunately, it really does seem like they are really gunning to capture the military completely. It's usually one of the most conservative institutions by nature, and it's one of the institutions that's the most trusted by the public. But they are well on their way to capturing that. Last time you and I spoke, and those who didn't actually hear, I don't think I said at the beginning of the episode, but we actually did this interview before on the military specifically, and basically the interview didn't say it for me, so that's why we had to have this conversation again. So there's a little bit of deja vu here, and I want to make sure that an important point you mentioned last time, you talked about specifically that there's essentially a sort of chaplain, a sort of pagan chaplain that's trying to recruit people into sort of like Norse paganism. You mentioned it briefly a moment ago, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so there are so many examples because people want to say, well, the COVID, what happened with COVID? Again, it's a symptom of a deeper problem in the military that we have going on. So everything else we see in society, the military is always going to be a microcosm of society. So some of these absurd things we see happening throughout the rest of the nation begin to happen in the military. So one of the things it was a brand new news story that was out right before we talked last time is you have. Herbert Field, which is an Air Force base in Florida, they were active. The chaplaincy was actively recruiting for their Norse pagan worship group. Okay,
Wow.
and why is that? Why is that such a big deal in the military? Well, again, it comes to something absurd because I would just ask the question: okay, what if someone is embracing Norse paganism as a religion, what does that mean? What does that stand for? What does that believe in? And is that in any way consistent with the fundamental values, even the core values of our United States military? There's a lot of things we could go into about Norse paganism, but living that out, is that what we want our military to do? And is that going to be, are we going to justify war crimes because someone is a Norse pagan?
Right.
Are we going to turn our back on those things? So those are the kinds of things that are happening. But trust in the military is so critical. So this is absolutely fascinating to me. In 2015, so I live in Pennsylvania. In Carlisle, Pennsylvania, you have the Army War College. So each branch of the service, the Navy has a war college, the Air Force has a war college, the Army War College, this prestigious institution that is designed to train senior military leaders, right? And even military leaders from all over the world come to the War College. And so they have professors and they teach these things. And one of the things that happened at the Army War College is said, we're going to do a study because we see, if you look at the big picture statistics, Congress has a very low trust from the American people. Other institutions have low levels of trust. Some have higher. The military had the highest level of trust. If you look at an institution, American society, 2015, the military had this high level of trust and respect from the American people. But at the same time, these professors at the Army War College did a study and they demonstrated in a paper that there was a integrity crisis in the United States Army Officer Corps in particular. And they just did simple things like looking at whether or not they were being honest in inspections and reports that military leaders are required to do. And they found that there were military leaders who were signing off as having completed all mandatory training for the year for their organization when it was actually physically impossible to complete all of the training requirements in a year because it was too many man hours, right? And so they realized there was just simple things where everyone is just checking the box and saying, yes, we did this, when it was impossible for them to have done so. And that just sticks out in my mind. I'll never forget that. I actually had dinner with one of the professors that was involved in that study, but it stuck in my mind because if you look at the military since then, you will now see a steady decline in trust in the military. So in other words, the American people are seeing concerns with integrity in the military. They're hearing stories. The biggest recruiting base for the military is always from families who have a history of military service,
Yeah.
right? It's always your second, third, fourth generation that typically serve in the military and continue to serve. And if you have a lack of trust, if you see leadership failures over and over again, then you have that. And that just brings in this ongoing crisis that you see. So COVID is just the most recent, situation. Many people saw it as a purge, that COVID was an excuse to purge
Right.
conservatives, Christians, to purge people that were going to take a stand and actually stand up for their oath and to test and see which leaders, were willing to fudge the rules just to get everybody in their unit and their organization vaccinated. So do I think there was an organized purge? Not necessarily, but look at the extreme extent that some military leaders went to with their unit and organization to get people vaccinated.
Yeah.
The Navy had a policy for many, many, many Navy units that prevented the unvaccinated military members from going to church. Couldn't go to church if you were
Interesting.
unvaccinated. You couldn't go on leave and go home to your family. There's a documentary put put out by the Republic Sentinel. It's called SEALs Beat Biden. It's available free at sealsbeatbiden.com.
Mhm.
But there's a Navy SEAL in there that was one of my clients, and he talks about the fact he was deployed, and the guys that were not vaccinated were told that they were quarantined. They were put in confinement-like conditions, and they were told they would not be able to go home. They would not be able to get onto a military plane and go home to their families at their end of deployment if they were not vaccinated, despite religious objections or other objections, or the process. That's the kind of pressure that was put on. And again, that just demonstrates there's things that were wrong. We could recognize it as wrong in the way that were handled, and yet military leaders went along with it because they wanted to protect their pension, they wanted to protect their career. There was a political agenda behind it, and it didn't start with COVID. It started with critical race theory. It started with other things before that. So now we have a military where we are using taxpayer dollars to pay for transgender surgeries. Now, just understand what that means. Hormone therapy and surgery for someone who is in the military means that individual, not only is it going to cost up to potentially $500,000 for all of that medical treatment, surgeries, and everything else to be done, that individual is not going to be fit to serve
Right.
for years, potentially, if they're undergoing that kind of therapy. So why does that even make sense on any level that we're going to use taxpayer money to do that in the military? And it's the same with the abortion travel issue. You know, the military has created a program where they are facilitating abortions by giving military members travel money. They're paying for their travel. They're giving them paid time off and free leave to go and travel out of state to have an abortion if they're stationed somewhere where there's a restriction on abortion and it's after that term or whatever it is. So those are things that are just evil. They're morally reprehensible, but our military is doing that. And that doesn't even go into the diversity, equity, inclusion, the critical race theory, and all these other critical theory things that are there, because that all happened even before COVID. I sat through that. I sat through training that would blow people's minds when it comes to what the military is teaching our military members. So it's not the Constitution. It's not, going out to the firing range and learning how to do your job. It's, oh, no, we're going to teach you that anyone who believes in something to the point where they'd be willing to risk their lives for an ideology is an extremist. Anyone who's willing to risk their lives for an ideology, for a belief system, is an extremist. And I'm sitting there in a room full of military officers going, that's what every one of us did when we swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. It's all foreign majestic. We're literally saying this is an idea. This is a system of beliefs that's founded in a constitution that we believe in so much we're willing to risk our lives for it. That's exactly what we're asked to do. And then you're calling us an extremist. So that's just a bizarre message to teach military members. Even worse, just this year, the Air Force had official training. And one of the things they were doing is they were talking about how to look for potential predators in the military when it comes to sexual assault. And they put out a training slide where they said one of the factors you should look for, among others, is if it is a male who is hyper masculine, who has a traditional view of marriage and human sexuality. Those are factors. Being masculine, and having a traditional view of marriage and human sexuality. Those are risk factors as a predator. That's what the United States Air Force is teaching our service members. So you wonder why there's a recruiting crisis. You wonder why we are having issues with retention. We're having issues with readiness and sustainability. And we haven't even touched on the disaster that was the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the impact that had on people like me, who that was my military service. My military service was the global war on terror.
Yeah.
I was in law school when 9/11 happened. I went into the military to support that effort. When I deployed, it was in support of what was happening in Afghanistan, and to see that disastrous withdrawal and to feel like it was for nothing. It was just to leave and it's go back.
Got a dog barking here.
That's all right. That's all right. So again, there's a lot of symptoms that are there in our military, and it's a huge problem, and it does create a national security risk that we have to deal with on some level. So um, again, obviously, that's my heartbeat. That's what I spend a lot of my time thinking about and working on issues related to that for military members, because I do care. I want to see us have a strong national defense. I want to see us have a government that prioritizes our own people, our own nation, protecting the innocent. But we're not there right now. We got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Once Upon a Reset said, "This upside down world isn't happening in a vacuum. The corruption is very much a construct, a contrived deconstruction, demolition of our current world order. The controlling cabal are incrementalists." And, kind of to your point, I don't know how much of it's intentional. I'm sure some of it is. I mean, you saw Dick Durbin, talked about maybe a couple weeks ago about trying to extend military membership to illegal immigrants. So it's like they quite literally are importing people who have no loyalty to the country, and obviously it's going to be a political battle to get there. But if the Democrats had their way, they would allow illegal immigrants to join the military, and many Republicans probably feel the same way. I mean, we see already how they're squishes when it comes to the military and pushing back on something the military requests. And ultimately, I don't want to get too conspiratorial here, but so many people, they, like you said, they trust the military, and obviously you've laid out reasons why maybe they should have some reservations. But I mean, how much more could you how much more would you trust the military where all the individuals are completely foreign, literally foreign to the country? And if they ever did want to do something like forced lockdowns, like some of the crazy stuff that we saw out of Australia and some of those places that went way more totalitarian in the lockdowns, I believe so many of our service members would absolutely have not stood for it. But they'll just replace them with illegal immigrants if they have their way, and people that are not loyal to the country. It's um, I believe it's no, it's not Plato. It's Aristotle that says the tyrant prefers the foreigner to the citizen, and unfortunately, that's kind of what we see with the Dick Durbin stuff. And then, of course, DEI only exacerbates the problem, because even those who came illegally, but then they have a next generation that is a citizen. Those are individuals that can go and apply currently and will get priority because of DEI systems already set in place in the military. So that's just ridiculous as well. I want to make sure that we spend some time talking about what you think actual solutions are for reforming our military, or if you want to say recapturing our military. And then, of course, please tell us about your work. It's really important. I did put sealsbeatbiden.com at the bottom of the screen there. Hopefully, I've got that correct. Feel free to correct me if I'm off on that. But go ahead, Davis. Tell us about what kind of things we can actually do to reform.
Yeah, I think that is a great question, and it takes time, right? We didn't get into this situation with our military overnight. We need to have people growing up. We need to have an education system in America. Need to have churches that talk about history well. The idea of bringing in foreign nationals, illegal immigrants into the military, that's part of what caused Rome to fall, right? So we have to recognize history, not just our own history, but ancient history. I mean, there was a time in the Roman Empire, people don't realize this, instead of referring to soldiers as soldiers in the Latin tongue, they had a term that essentially meant barbarian. There were so many foreigners in the legions that they started referring to all Roman soldiers as barbarians in that. So I say that to say we need an appreciation for our own history, but ultimately the bottom line is it is a sin issue. We see, cultural rot in our society because of sin, and because people are not repenting and turning to God. It's the same in our military. Just like the rest of our society was designed for a moral people, our founding documents were written and thought through by men, even if they weren't all Christians or born again Christians. They at least understood the language of the Bible, and they looked to it as a moral and ethical guide. And we're losing that in our military. We're not even teaching it. We're bringing in people into the military that are taught in public schools to hate the United States, to see us as a nation as like colonial oppressors, right? And then you bring those people into the military. What are you fighting for? And so we do need to understand and go back to some of those founding principles. We need to bring God back into the military, and we need to be able to then recognize and understand just war theory and some of those concepts. So what are the solutions? We do need Christians in the military. So one of the things I've been working on since the COVID is we've started during COVID. We started an organization called Stand with Warriors. So Stand with Warriors is an organization that was started by Navy SEALs and pastors, Apologia Church. Jeff Durbin and those guys helped start it as a 501c3 to help these guys. In the coming months, it's going to morph into kind of two phases. One, we have pastors and former Navy SEALs, some who were kicked out over the COVID vaccine mandate, that are going to be leading small group discipleship and evangelism efforts within the special operations community, within the military. Tip of the spear guys to sort of be the tip of the spear to bring Christ back into the military. So these fundamental values are part of it. And then I'm going to be working with attorneys, and we're going to build out a way to help Christians in the military address these issues. So we'll do training, and then we'll be there to legally defend and help Christians within the military, administratively and otherwise, when they're dealing with these issues, when they're dealing with pronoun mandates and all of those things. So a lot more is coming from those. That's a big part of the work that I'm doing. And I would just, covet anyone who's listening to this, your prayer, your thoughtfulness for us as we work on these things. There's a lot of work to be done. And, hopefully churches will engage with this, and pastors will be more comfortable engaging on these issues and understanding we just can't abandon the public square and not expect there to be dire consequences if we do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's such important work. I see the site here. It does show where you can donate. So, yeah, guys, standwithwarriors.org. Honestly, important work. I mean, you don't want to even begin to imagine the terrors of a military that is completely atheistic, devoid of anything Christian and anything moral, and being completely captured to do the bidding of people in charge that really don't like you. They don't like you or your values, as we see so many times with the type of stories that we cover on this podcast. So, standwithwarriors.org. Please go and help Davis out. Davis, I did ask you this last time, and it put you on the spot a little bit, but I think it's important with 2024 coming up. What are your thoughts on the Republican primary, and specifically specifically when it comes to the military and just your profession? Who do you think is like going to actually bring about a positive change in the military? Do you think there's one guy better than the other, or do you really think that it's kind of a toss up at this point? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, what I will say is, under the current administration, everything related to military policy, from my perspective, almost without exception, has been a disaster. So I don't see looking to reelect the current administration making a lot of sense. I don't see answers there, right? Like, I mean, that I think that's pretty clear. It's very interesting. What I will say with the Trump administration is that you saw him follow through on bringing service members home and working towards getting us out of constant forever wars. So that's something that I look at and say, okay, there was some follow through there. DeSantis is another candidate who has actually served in the military, who has deployed, who has that background. And while I don't think that's necessary for a commander in chief to have a military background, I think some military service is really, really important, and it should be something we look for on a resume. So I do think those are issues I think people need to dig into. And I would just submit there was some follow through with these issues with President Trump, but I also think that DeSantis has some clear issues that are worth looking at, studying, seeing what he's saying on those things, because I think that would make a difference. I am not a fan of anyone in politics who is advocating for spending money to protect other nations' borders, but isn't doing nothing or not advocating for the protection of our own. So I think those are things to look at and think about, because if we're not prioritizing the safety of our own people and the security of our own border when it comes to our military policy, then what is the purpose of our military? Because it really shouldn't be about empire building and projecting power overseas, especially if we can't protect our own border.
Yeah. Say no to Nikki Haley, guys. Oh man, but
I think it's pretty obvious what we're talking about when we say that, right? I think that's pretty obvious.
absolutely. I don't know, Chris Christie. I mean, he's real conservative. Kidding. Everyone's gonna clip that and absolutely beat me to death with it. So, do you actually think that in the year 2023 that young men should enlist? That's the real question that so many people want answered.
Yeah, it is really, really hard. It breaks my heart to say I struggle mightily with that question. Even 10 years ago, very little hesitation on that. So what I do, and what I would encourage anyone that's working with a young man that's thinking about serving, is ask why. And that's what I do. I say, why? Why is it you think God is calling you to this? Why is it you think you want to serve? And that I think brings on healthy conversations, because often there is a commercialized or idealized view of what military service is and what it means. And often there's some misnomers. Other young men are prepared. So it's just like anything else. We need to be preparing our young men through discipleship, through the church, having them around men so that they're prepared to go out. You have to go into military service now and see it, if you're called to it, as a mission field, and understand you're going to have to be prepared to give up your military career potentially if things happen that are going to mandate you to violate your Christian faith. So just like there were Navy SEALs who saw what was going on with the COVID vaccine and believed it was wrong, it would violate their faith to go along with it, they were willing to give up their trident, right? This thing that they worked so hard and so few people could ever achieve. They were willing to take their trident off, put it on the table, and sacrifice that for their faith. Anyone that goes into military service now needs to go in with that same mindset, because at any moment, we're already beginning to fight battles like mandatory pronoun use. So there's going to be, gender tyranny and pronoun tyranny in the military. As a Christian, are you going to go along with that lie? Are you going to go along with that false narrative that hurts people, actually damages people's eternal souls? If we go along with it, there's going to be a lot of difficult things that our young men that want to serve are going to face.
Mm. Yeah, that's good advice. Definitely some things to think about. I'm sure that there are some people, given the demographics of our audience, you may have answered an important question for them. So I really appreciate your transparency on that. Um, we have just a little bit of time left, and I wanted to talk just briefly about your thoughts on sort of the balkanization that's occurred. This is me getting more into your military expertise than your lawyer expertise, maybe, but there's definitely an overlap there. The balkanization of the U.S. that's happened over the last several years, that really COVID accelerated greatly, and then of course there's talks of national divorce. And then, of course, we saw that there's a new movie coming out based on a fictional American Civil War. And a lot of people have said that that's predictive programming that, Hollywood and the sort of powers that be are trying to mentally prepare us for our future that they are trying to fabricate. So, what's your thoughts on all that? Whether or not a national divorce is a good idea, whether or not you think civil war is possible, what your take on just the balkanization is.
I think it's deeply concerning. And what I will say is this, we have to learn from history. Our nation fought a horrific and bloody and terrible civil war. And a lot of it happened because there was a breakdown in faith in the political process, right? If you can't resolve things through peaceful debate and discussion and the valid political process, or there's just pure evil that's persisting, then things can get very bad and very ugly. So, I think what we need to be trying to understand as a nation that's going to help is things like election integrity, right? And I don't want to go crazy conspiracy theory or anything else, but I just want to say if people lose faith in our election process, if people don't trust the elective process, if they don't think their vote is going to make a difference anymore, that's when we start to see people looking at the two other things or feeling forced to go to other things to, protect themselves, protect their families, protect their way of life. And so that's what's dangerous. So, you know, I I I tend to think we have a large federal government that is out of control. I think that any move towards centralization, when we think about government, is a mistake. It leads to tyranny. It leads to waste. So I think there's been just a gradual push since the American Civil War towards more and more centralized power. I think that's a mistake. We should be finding ways to reduce the size of the federal government, to reduce the permanent bureaucracy, and return power to local governments in the states. I think that's what we should be focusing on. And then you don't need a civil war, right? The founding fathers, there were founding fathers that talked about each state was an experiment, right? That's been part of our dialogue. If you don't like what's happening in California, you can move to Florida, you can move to Oklahoma, you can move to Texas. If you don't like what's happening in California, you can move to another state that's different. I think that's the model we should look for. And we should be, in some respects, in a civil society, we should be okay with saying, okay, if that's what you want, then we should be able to free to leave and go somewhere else. But if we have too large of a federal government, if we have a federal government that is captured by people that seem to be essentially communist in their political philosophy or Marxist in their philosophy and their desire for centralized control, that's the problem. And ultimately, that's going to lead to tyranny, which I do think then is going to lead to potentially conflict that spills over from the political into actual violence.
Mm, yeah. Well, let's pray that that doesn't happen. Let's
Amen,
pray
brother.
that we'll see revival in the land, and let's pray that we'll see revival in our military. So, again, guys, go to standwithwarriors.org. Really help out what Davis is doing because, again, I just can't stress enough. I think a a captured military, specifically captured by the people that are currently pushing some of the most godless, vile stuff that are defending Satan statues in Capitol buildings. It's just something we can't even imagine the horrors that could come about that if that fully happens. So standwithwarriors.org. Also check out sealsbeatbiden.com. So you said that's a documentary that was put on by the Republic Sentinel.
Yeah, that's right. The guys at the Republic Sentinel put that on. That's the
Awesome.
first documentary they've done. So the first, it's a 3-part series, and so the first episode is out, and then there'll be 2 more segments that they're going to release. But it really does do a great job of telling the story, really from the perspective of military members, Navy SEALs, a pilot, of what happened during the COVID vaccine mandate, and then eventually they get into concepts of what we do moving forward in our military and sort of the bigger picture and what we're battling.
Awesome. Cool. Well, everyone check that out because I think that's really insightful and it's good to be knowledgeable about the biggest issues that are facing us in the year 2023, soon to be 2024. So that being said, this actually is going to be the last episode of Forge and Anvil for the year because I believe very next Monday is Christmas, which is absolutely wild. I was considering doing a Christmas special for you all before Christmas occurred, but decided not to go that route. So my apologies for anyone that was on pins and needles just waiting for that. But either way, we do appreciate you guys listening to us. So be sure to be on the lookout for us in the new year. I've already got guests booked out well into February and some awesome guests. And, it's always hard. You want to announce it and promote it as much as you can. In advance, but at the same time, the nature of podcasts, people have bailed on me 5 minutes till before as you guys have seen with some of our past episodes. And that's just the nature of people get sick. We had John Moody was going to come on and he had some sickness in his family, just things like that. So I won't spoil too much in advance, but I'm just going to say that we have some really interesting guests coming up all January and February. So be sure to join us for that. The first Monday of January 1st, the first day of the new year, we'll be bringing it in hot. So really join us for that. We appreciate it. And so, Davis, where can people go to find you and keep up with everything you're doing? Where can people go to just support you and all your work?
Yeah, the I'm on Twitter, so I'm pretty active on there. So at Davis Younts on Twitter, that's a great way to just keep up with some of the things we're doing. Obviously, standwithwarriors.org. As we grow and build out our plans for next year, we'll be announcing more there. My law firm's website is my last name, Younts, Younts law.com. Of course, you can check out what we're doing there as well. And just really, prayer is the biggest thing for me. I just appreciate and covet everyone's prayers for wisdom, and that we can, use the work we're doing with Stand With Warriors, with my law firm, to bring the gospel and just try to seek God's justice in a fallen world.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Davis. It was great having you back on, and we'll definitely have you back on in the future as well to give us updates on the work that you're doing, as well as I'm sure we'll have a story or two, given the state of our world, that we'll undoubtedly want your expertise on. So thanks again, and thank you everyone for joining us for the live stream. Be sure to join us Monday nights, 8 p.m. Central, if you want to be a part of the live stream and be in the chats. We answered quite a few tonight on YouTube and Rumble, so be sure to join us there. And if you're listening on the podcast platforms, be sure to give us a 5-star rating. We really appreciate it. It does help us out. And we will see you all next time.